Okay, hello Year 8. This is Mrs. Barrett doing a lesson for you today on the poem Blessing. You can get all of the resources for the poem Blessing on the school closure website, and this is a PowerPoint that will go alongside the comprehension booklet on the poem. It's a fantastic poem and one that I really want everybody to have a go at, and it's by a lady called Imtiaz Dharker, and that particular poet is someone who will be really important when you study for your GCSEs, because she does another poem that will be in the group or the cluster of poems that you'll study for your GCSE English Literature exam. So she's somebody that you really need to get familiar with. Okay, so if you have a look on the very first slide, we can see that Blessing was written by Imtiaz Dharker in 1989. And our learning objective today is that we're going to explore the context and gain an understanding of the poem Blessing. Now, as I say, the context of this poem is really important, because any information that you can learn and understand and remember now is fantastic for when you reach GCSE, and that's why we've chosen to do this unit of work. It's a really important unit of work on poetry, and in particular this one will help you in the future. So your starter task is to have a think about what the title Blessing makes you think of and what words you might associate with this picture. I'm just going to ask you to pause the video for a couple of minutes so that you can start to think about what the title Blessing makes you think of and what words you associate with the picture that's on the PowerPoint. Okay, now the word blessing is an interesting word and might mean different things to different people, and that's absolutely fine. There doesn't necessarily have to be just one answer, and that's the same when you're looking at all different types of poems. Just because one person thinks of one thing, it doesn't mean that you're wrong if you think something different. So the title Blessing makes me think of something that you really appreciate, something that you feel grateful for. That to me is a blessing, and it might also have, to some people, some religious connotations, things that you think of with regards to religion and maybe being blessed by God. With regards to the picture, you might have thought of things like children playing in the water, children having fun, maybe even children appreciating the water, and that's something we'll come on to when we have a look at the poem in more detail. Okay. Now there are, and you will notice on each of the slides, there are keywords, for example, and aiming higher sections, and you just need to go for the parts of this presentation that you think will really help you with your understanding of the poem. And if you want to stretch and challenge yourself, then absolutely have a look at the aim higher questions, and you'll see that there are some questions later on in the PowerPoint that you will really want to have a go at if you're aiming for those higher grades in English now and at GCSE. Okay, so the keywords that you can see in the right hand corner there are all techniques that you might well be able to spot in this poem. The first is assonance, alliteration, enjambment, metaphor, oxymoron, personification, and simile. Okay, and the aiming higher question is, what is visceral imagery? And that really links with that question about what words you might associate with the picture. Visceral imagery is all to do with animalistic pictures and sort of things that people might be doing instinctively. So have a think about that with regards to the picture that we've got on the board or on the PowerPoint at the moment. Okay, moving on. So this is just to make sure that you know exactly where to go to on the school closure website. As I say, these poems from other cultures are really worthwhile you having a look through, and even if you don't get a chance to do all of them, or if you only get a chance to do some of each of the booklets, it's going to be hugely helpful, and will make sure that you are ready when you get into year 9 to start preparing for your GCSE exams, because poetry is a big section in the literature exam. Okay, the one that I've circled just here is Blessing, and that's what we're going to work on today. Okay, so this is the information about the poet herself. As I say, this information is something that you will probably want to make some notes on under the subheading context of the poem. I'll just use my pen here to help you with making sure that you're looking at the right bits, the same bits as me. So make some notes relating to the context of the poem. That means all to do with the poet herself, to do with her background, to do with her inspiration for writing this particular poem. And as I say, it's something that you can learn and try to remember and keep in your mind so that you have it ready when you start to study another poem written by herself for GCSE. So if we go over to the left-hand side, Imtiaz Dharker, she was born in 1954 and she is a Pakistan-born British poet. So although she was born in Pakistan, she considers herself to be British. She's not only a poet, but she's also an artist and a documentary filmmaker too. And she's won the Queen's Gold Medal for her English poetry. So she's someone that's really well known. Dharker was born in Lahore, Punjab, Pakistan, to Pakistani parents, but she was brought up in Glasgow, which is in Scotland, where her family moved to when she was less than a year old. So that's why she considers herself to be British, despite having Pakistani parents. She was married to Simon Powell, and he was the founder of the organisation Poetry Live, which is a trip that might well become available to you when you start to study some more poems in the lead up to your GCSEs. It's a fantastic event if you can get there. School usually do trips up to London to go and see these poets live, and Imtiaz Dharker is usually always there. So she got married to Simon Powell, the founder of that organisation, but unfortunately he died in October 2009 after surviving for 11 years with cancer. Now, as it says in the middle, she's written 5 books of poetry. You can see some of the titles here: Purdah, Postcards from God, I Speak for the Devil, The Terrorist at My Table, Leaving Fingerprints, Over the Moon, and they've all been self-illustrated. Okay, that means that she herself has decided to do accompanying drawings with the poems as she's gone along, and that's something that actually quite a lot of poets do. For example, William Blake, another poet that you will study at GCSE, he self-illustrated all of his poems, not only because he enjoyed art and being artistic along with his poetry, but also because at the time of writing, if he were to do illustrations, do pictures with his poems, then it'd be very difficult for people to plagiarise, in other words, copy some of his poems. So that made sure that his poems stayed his poems and nobody else's. As it says down the bottom here, Dharker lives in India, in the city of Bombay. So although she's saying that she's British, she does live in India. And the poem that we're looking at today, called Blessing, is set in an area of temporary accommodation called Dharavi, on the outskirts of Bombay, where millions of migrants have gathered from other parts of India. As it's not an official living area, there is always a shortage of water, and that's something that we'll come on to when we read the poem a lot more, but worthwhile remembering for now. In an interview, the poet said, "When a pipe bursts, when a water tanker goes past, there's always a little child running behind the water tanker, getting the bits of drips, and it's like money. The water itself is like currency." Is that important to them? In a hot country, in that kind of climate, it's like a gift. And the children may have been brought up in the city and grown up as migrants, but the mothers will probably remember in the village they've come from, they would have to walk miles with pots to get to a well as the closest water source. So it really is, the water itself is really very precious. And when the water comes, she says, it's like a god. Okay, and that links really nicely back to what we were saying at the start of our lesson today about the fact that a blessing can have those religious links as well. Okay, I'll leave that on there just for 30 seconds more for you to make sure you've got down the key notes from there. You can see I've got around 5 or 6 things that I would definitely jot down that will help me with my understanding of not only this poet, but also the poem itself as well. Okay, let's move on. So here is our poem. Okay, I'm going to have a read of it to you as well, and then once I've had a read of it, as it says in the instructions in this box over here, I want you to pause the video for a couple of minutes and read it through on your own. You can read it on your own out loud, or you can read it just in your head. That's absolutely fine. And what's really important when you have a very first read of a poem is that you spend some time thinking about what you think overall the poem is about, what it really means, and then take some time to just highlight anything that stands out to you, any key words or any phrases, and then that will help you to answer the second part of this little task, which is what are your first impressions of the poem? Are there any structural language techniques or words that stand out to you? Now, as it says in the middle of the slide today, page 5 in the booklet is where you'll find a copy of the poem, and it's really important that when you do look at a poem like this, you have a highlighter, you have a pen, and everything that you highlight you try and label as well, because otherwise when you look back at it you might think, I don't understand why I did that, or things like that, and that's something you really have to get used to doing and become familiar with in the lead up to your GCSEs, because you'll be given a poetry anthology, which is a book of poems that will be in your real exam, and you have to make sure that your highlighting and your labelling is really good when you're in lesson time, so that when you take it home you can make sure that you can revise from it, you understand what the poem's about when you're on your own, even if you've sort of forgotten things. That's why your notes are so important. Okay, so I'll read it through once to you, and then I'll ask you to pause the video, and then you can do your own read and do a little bit of highlighting too. So, Blessing by Imtiaz Dharker. The skin cracks like a pod. There never is enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash, echo in a tin mug, the voice of a kindly God. Sometimes the sudden rush of fortune. The municipal pipe bursts. Silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues. From the huts a congregation. Every man, woman, child, for streets around butts in, with pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands, and naked children screaming in the liquid sun. Their highlights polished to perfection, flashing light as the blessing sings over their small bones. Okay, so pause the video now, spend a couple of minutes reading it through on your own, as I say, out loud or in your head, and then start to just do anything that stands out to you, give it an underline or give it a highlight, and see if you can label it with your first impressions of why you think she used those words to describe this event, and the picture might well help you there as well. Okay, so when you've done that, hopefully you've got a few things highlighted and you've had a read of it yourself and taken a bit more time to digest some of those words. Some of those words might look a little bit difficult, and sometimes you'll come across words that you find difficult in your real GCSE poems too, that you haven't heard of, and it's really important that you spend some time looking up those words, finding their definitions, and writing them next to the poem to help you. All right, and you can absolutely do that with this poem too. Okay, now before we have a little look at a video which I've included within the PowerPoint here, I want to just highlight and show some of the things that maybe stood out to me as particularly important, do a little bit of highlighting on the poem and labelling, so that you can also add to your own annotations and see whether you've got similar things to me. Again, doesn't matter if you don't have the same as me, you can absolutely have different annotations and different things that you've highlighted. Doesn't mean that you're wrong or I'm wrong, it just means that we've picked out different things. So the first thing that really stood out to me was the very first line, the skin cracks like a pod. I can't help but notice that's a really fantastic simile that Imtiaz has used here to describe what the surface of the earth is like in India, which is quite hard for us to imagine in the UK. The skin cracks like a pod. So it's almost like there's big cracks in the earth everywhere, and like big wrinkles maybe in the earth, and that's because they've not had any water for a very long time. Okay, I also really liked the where it says imagine the drip of it. It really gets you thinking about that sound that comes with water, and by using the senses it makes us imagine it a lot clearer. Sorry about my writing on here, it's a bit difficult. That it makes you imagine it a lot clearer. You can imagine your own dripping of the water and how the children that lived in these very difficult areas with very little water, how they might imagine the sound and hope and pray for rain, or hope and pray for any type of water. There's also quite a lot of references to God, as I mentioned, maybe, which links with the title as well of the poem. There's lots of religious references, and that's something to pick up on as you go along. We've got the blessing sings down the bottom as well. We've got the word congregation, which is a word that you would usually hear being used in church, which is a group of people that make up the congregation in a church service. Okay, so I'm just putting religious here, and then I'll make my arrows hopefully relatively clear. Just here. You could of course do a key. If you notice a pattern when you're looking at a poem, you could do a key, so that if you were looking for only religious references, you could use a different colour than all your other annotations. And there was only one other thing I really wanted to pick up on to start with, which is that picture that you get of the children running after the water coming, and that's those frantic hands and the naked children screaming in the liquid sun. Okay, just highlights how hot it is, and how those children have very, very little, so that just looking for water and just getting something as basic as water is a blessing. It's something that they appreciate so much, and something that maybe we take for granted. We can just turn our tap on, but of course they can't do that. Okay, so spend a little bit of time having a look there and seeing whether you highlighted any of the same things. Remember, as I said, it doesn't have to be those things. They're just things that stood out to me, and they're things that I would want to explore in greater detail if I were to be writing a response to this poem. Now, I've included a link you can see just above Imtiaz Dharker's face, just here. It's a BBC bite-sized clip, which is, by the way, a really good place to have a look if you're struggling with any poems that you're set, because they usually have some really excellent, very helpful guidance. BBC bite-size. So what I would suggest is that you pause the video now. The link, if you copy that link or just right click and open the hyperlink, you'll be able to watch it, and it's just 3 minutes about Imtiaz Dharker herself explaining her background and the inspiration for this poem. And I thought by having a look at her and looking at how she expresses herself, you might well get to know this poem just a little bit more. So pause this video, have a little look, spend 3 minutes having a watch, and if there's anything you want to add to your contextual information, the notes that you made on the previous slide, then you can absolutely do that. Okay, hopefully you managed to get some nice information about her. Remember, as I said, she is one of your GCSE poets, so anything you pick up now will be really useful. Okay, now we've started to have a look at annotating this poem already. Hopefully you've started to do that too. I wonder whether you've started to look for or think about finding any of these techniques, the ones that are written on the right hand side there in the box. If you already noticed some as you were going along in your first impressions, then absolutely jot those down. Make sure you've labelled them as you've gone along. And what you'll notice is that we've got mostly language techniques here. We've got a metaphor, we've got simile, personification, but you can also look out for some structural techniques as well. This one, enjambment, is when there's no punctuation at the end of a line. So for example here, there's no punctuation at the end of the line. It makes you carry on reading and have a think about what that flow could represent when you know what the poem is really about. Okay, what else maybe might be flowing in this poem, and maybe that's why she's decided to use this enjambment. And what's also a lovely thing to start thinking about is the actual shape itself of the poem. Have you noticed that not all the lines start in the same place, that they're indented, that some of them are shorter, some of them are longer? Why do you think maybe the poet decided to do it in this way? What could this, you might even call this a bit of a flow, what do you think that flow might represent? Again, having some ideas and thinking about that and putting that down into an answer would get you lots of marks and would be really impressive. So if you want to find some more of those techniques, spend a couple more minutes, pause the video, carry on looking for those. Okay, now this is aimed to help you make sure you've annotated, and remember annotated means highlighting and labelling. This is a little task to help to make sure that you've found as much as you can in the poem, because I know from having a look at my own Year 8 class that some people have found highlighting and labelling actually quite difficult, and these questions will help you to be able to find lots of different things that you can look for, not only about techniques but things like shade any words that make you think of water, for example. That's a lovely thing to do, and it is also a technique. If you're aiming for those top grades, you might want to refer to the fact that there's a group of words that all have something in common, and that's called a semantic field. Again, sorry about my writing, a semantic field. But whether you remember that fancy technique or not, or whether you just say that you found a group of words that are all connecting together with water, absolutely fine. You'd still get lots of marks for that if you were to put it in an answer. Okay, so I've suggested you spend about 15 minutes working your way through. You don't have to do all of these tasks, you might just do one or two of them, but all of your answers to the questions and all of your finding and colouring and highlighting should all be on the poem. So by the end of the 15 minutes, your poem will look really like it's got lots of excellent points, lots of things that you've found and that you've made, as I said, really good notes, which will help you look at this poem in greater detail if you were to answer an exam response on it. Okay, pause it and then have a go, see what you can get up to in those 15 minutes. Right, moving on again. Now this is one of those slides that you can have a go at. You could do one or two of the questions, you could do none of them, you could do all of them. It depends on what you're aiming for. If you're aiming for those top grades, so looking between sort of grades 6 to 8, then definitely make sure you have a go at these questions. It might just sort of push you up that little bit further to make sure you've got everything out of it. There's some more on the next slide as well. Aim higher extension questions, and again this is if you really want to go that step further in your analysis, and you can do all of them again or you can just do one or two. It's completely up to you, but I'm sure that if your teachers were to see how many of these questions you've answered and how much you've managed to find within the poem, they'd be really impressed. Okay, now we're at the sort of just over halfway point, I would have thought, maybe a little bit more, but whatever time you have left of the lesson or whatever time you have left to spend on your English work today, I've written a few different tasks that you could have a go at that will really demonstrate and show off your understanding of this poem to your teacher, and you just need to pick one of the activities to have a go at. So your first one over here, write a diary entry for one of the children explaining their situation. So how do you think these children might be feeling in this situation? You could, if you wanted to do some drawing, you could draw 3 or 4 pictures that symbolise the poem. Poems often have lots of symbols within them, and that's something that you can pick out and even draw yourself, but you must make sure that you explain your choices. So maybe underneath each of the pictures that you draw, you sort of say what each picture or each symbol is meant to represent and how that links with the poem. Or you could write a speech persuading people to help these children and these people that are in very, very dry lands and desperately need water. Or the last one, you could write the opening part of a story based around the poem, and you could pick any aspect of the poem you like. It could be to do with children, it could be to do with the weather itself. You could do a beautiful description of Bombay and the living arrangements that these children have to grow up in. Think back to that very first line, the skin cracking like a pod. Think how you could develop just going from that one line to making your own version of a story. Okay. Now, if you wanted to have a go at all of these, I'm sure your teacher would be absolutely so thrilled and really impressed. And that's why at the bottom here I've just said your extension can be to complete all 4 of the tasks over a few lessons or a few days, and then send it on to your teacher. And it's really important that whatever you decide to do today, whether you do all of the annotations, whether you get all that lovely contextual information about the poet herself, and those responses to the questions and this particular creative task, it's really important that you send what you do to your teacher, be it all of it, some of it, whatever you do. Please send it on to your teacher in whatever format you can do. I know lots of people don't have printers at home, or lots of people might find it difficult to write onto the PDFs, but there's no reason why you couldn't write it on a bit of paper, take a picture and email it to them, or simply write your answers to the questions or what your answer to one of these tasks and type it straight into an email to show them. Whatever way is easiest for you, do that. Okay. Now, as a review today, we're just going to look back at our learning objective from the very beginning of our lesson, which is to explore the context and gain an understanding of the poem Blessing. And I really hope that by doing these activities, you feel that you could tick off that learning objective, and that you feel a lot more confident with this particular poem, and that confidence will then help you with the other poems within the school closures online resource area, because there are some really lovely ones. If you wanted a recommendation for which one to move on to, the poem Not My Business is a fantastic poem with excellent personification in, all about a Jeep, and it really is amazing. So have a go at that, and if you want to use those comprehension booklets, that would be really, really helpful, along with potentially a little bit of research online, because the background information for that poem in particular is really important to its understanding. So, as your review, think about whether you've managed to meet that learning objective, and lastly, what key words and phrases stand out to you as important from this poem. Could just be one, could be a phrase. And what are you going to remember most about this poem? What would you tell your teacher if you could see them now, or what will you tell them in September that you remember about this poem, whether you liked it or you didn't like it? Okay, really well done today, fantastic work. No matter what you've done, just make sure that you send it on to your teacher, and that you take that confidence to use your skills looking at another poem as well. Try and do as many as you can in this time. All right, thank you so much.